At dawn, the stone corridors of the conciergerie are still wet with cold. Iron keys scrape against each other, slow and deliberate, as a guard unlocks the final door. You can almost hear it before you see her. The soft sound of hair falling to the floor. Strands of white blonde hair cut away not for mercy, but for efficiency. Outside, a crowd is already gathering. Some whisper. Others wait in silence, hungry for what comes next. She stands there without a crown, without silk, without a name. No longer a queen, no longer even Marie Antoinette. Just a body prepared for death. The air smells of damp stone and sweat. Every movement is watched. Every breath is counted. She knows this is not the beginning of the end. It is the end of a long process that started months earlier, when humiliation replaced justice, and cruelty wore the mask of law. Can you imagine knowing you were destroyed long before the blade ever fell? And why did they need to break her so completely before they allowed her to die? To understand what happened to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine, you must first step into France in 1793. This was not the Romantic Revolution of paintings and slogans. This was the phase historians later called the Reign of Terror, a period where fear became policy and suspicion replaced evidence. The monarchy had fallen, but the new republic was fragile, paranoid, and desperate to prove its moral authority. For years, Marie Antoinette had existed in the public imagination as a symbol rather than a person. Pamphlets portrayed her as wasteful, foreign, corrupt. The Austrian woman, they called her, a reminder that she was never truly French in the eyes of the crowd. Long before her arrest, propaganda had already prepared the ground. The people were taught not just to hate her, but to need her downfall. History books often describe the French Revolution as a triumph of liberty over tyranny. And in many ways, it was. But revolutions do not survive on ideals alone. They survive by identifying enemies. The Republic required visible proof that the old world was dead, and Marie Antoinette's body became the stage upon which that proof would be performed. After the execution of Louis XVI, she was no longer a queen or even a political figure. She was renamed Widow Capet, stripped of identity, stripped of dignity. Her children were taken from her one by one. Her letters were confiscated. Her words were monitored. She was moved from the relative isolation of the Temple prison to the conciergerie, a place the people called the antechamber of death. The conciergerie was not designed for rehabilitation or reflection. It was designed to erase people. Prisoners entered knowing most would never leave alive. Damp stone walls, straw beds crawling with insects, guards who watched even as prisoners slept or changed their clothes. Privacy was abolished entirely. At this point, Marie Antoinette's fate was already decided. The trial that awaited her was not meant to ask whether she was guilty. It was meant to explain to the public why her destruction was necessary. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the verdict was already written, what purpose did the suffering serve? And why did the revolution need her humiliation before it could accept her death? The fall of Marie Antoinette did not happen in a single moment. It was not the storming of the palace, nor the sound of the guillotine. It was a slow, methodical process, designed to dismantle her identity piece by piece. Power was not simply taken from her. It was unlearned, forced out of her body through routine, surveillance, and humiliation. When she was transferred from the Temple prison to the conciergerie in August 1793, the message was unmistakable. The Temple had been a holding cell. The conciergerie was a waiting room for execution. Prisoners called it the vestibule of death. Those who entered rarely returned. Her cell was small, damp, and constantly lit. Guards sat just feet away, day and night. There was no curtain, no screen, no moment of privacy. Even while changing clothes or washing, she was watched. Not because she posed a threat, but because control itself had become the punishment. The female body, once surrounded by layers of etiquette and distance, was now fully exposed to the state. She was no longer addressed by name. Marie Antoinette was erased. Queen was forbidden. Official documents referred to her only as Widow Capet, a legal fiction designed to sever her from history, marriage, and sovereignty in one stroke. Language itself became a weapon. If she had no title, no lineage, no past, then she could be remade into whatever the revolution required. Her appearance was deliberately altered. The elaborate dresses, corsets, and powdered wigs vanished. She was given plain white clothing, identical to that of other condemned prisoners. Her hair, once the subject of caricature and obsession, was allowed to turn white from stress and isolation. Later, it would be cut short, not as an act of mercy, but to ensure the blade would fall cleanly. But the most devastating blow was not physical. It was maternal. Her son, Louis Charles, was taken from her and placed under the control of revolutionary guards. She was not told where he was being held. She was not allowed to see him. She could hear rumors of his treatment, but had no way to confirm them. Her daughter was removed soon after. Marie Antoinette, who had been accused for years of being a negligent, indulgent mother, was now forcibly transformed into a woman without children. This separation was not incidental. It was strategic. A woman isolated can be broken. A mother isolated can be destroyed. Every letter she wrote was intercepted. Every word she spoke was recorded. Even silence was interpreted as guilt. Guards noted her posture, her expressions, her tone. She existed under constant interpretation as if her very presence were a confession waiting to be decoded. You might ask why this level of control was necessary. She was already imprisoned. She was already powerless. But revolutions, like monarchies, understand symbolism. To execute a queen was not enough. She had to be unmade first. The public needed to see not a martyr, but a diminished figure, someone whose suffering justified the violence to come. By the time her trial was announced, Marie Antoinette had already been living in a state of psychological siege for weeks. Sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, emotional deprivation. Her body remained alive, but her social existence had been methodically erased. And this was only the preparation. Because what awaited her in the courtroom was not justice, nor even accusation in the traditional sense. It was something far more calculated. A performance designed to complete what imprisonment had begun. So the question sharpens. If prison stripped her of identity, what did the trial intend to strip away next? The trial of Marie Antoinette began on October 14, 1793. By then, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The courtroom of the Revolutionary Tribunal was not a place for deliberation. It was a stage. And every stage requires a script, a villain, and an audience ready to applaud the ending. She entered the courtroom pale, visibly weakened by weeks of confinement. Witnesses noted how much she had changed. Her posture was still composed, but her body bore the marks of exhaustion. This was not accidental. A broken figure is easier to condemn than a defiant one. The revolution did not want a queen standing tall. It wanted proof that the old world was already rotting. The charges read aloud were long and deliberately vague. Treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, draining the treasury, undermining the nation. None of these accusations were supported by concrete evidence. They did not need to be. In a climate where fear ruled, plausibility mattered more than proof. The public had been trained for years to associate her name with betrayal. Then came the accusation that silenced the room. She was charged with incest, with corrupting her own son. This was not a legal argument. It was a psychological weapon. The charge was introduced late in the proceedings, almost casually, as if it were merely another item on a list. But its purpose was precise. It aimed to destroy her not as a political figure, but as a mother and as a woman. If the crowd could be made to believe this, then no mercy would ever be demanded. Compassion would become impossible. Her son, a child already broken by separation and manipulation, had been coerced into signing statements prepared by his handlers. He was taught what to say, rewarded for obedience, punished for hesitation. The words attributed to him were read aloud in court as if they carried moral authority. Marie Antoinette listened in silence. When the presiding judge demanded a response, she did not answer immediately. Then she spoke not to the tribunal, but to the women in the audience. She appealed not to law, but to shared humanity. She reminded them that nature itself recoils at such an accusation, that a mother's bond is not something politics should be allowed to desecrate. For a brief moment, the room shifted. Even among those who despised her, there was discomfort. Murmurs spread. Some later claimed the crowd was visibly shaken. The accusation had gone too far. But the moment passed quickly. Revolutions do not retreat once they have crossed a line. To withdraw the charge would be to admit excess, and excess had become the engine of power. From that point on, the trial accelerated. Defense witnesses were dismissed. Interruptions were constant. The jury, selected for ideological loyalty rather than impartiality, deliberated through the night. The verdict was announced in the early hours of the morning. Guilty on all counts, death by guillotine. No one in the room appeared surprised. The trial had lasted less than 2 days, but the damage it inflicted could not be measured in hours. Marie Antoinette had been publicly stripped of the final identity that remained to her. Not queen, not wife, not even mother. Only a monster. And once a person has been transformed into a monster in the public mind, the act of killing them no longer feels like violence. It feels like sanitation. The revolution had accomplished something crucial. It had taught the crowd not just that she must die, but that she deserved to suffer first. So ask yourself, if the trial was never about truth, what was its real function? And why did her body, more than her actions, become the center of the spectacle? Long before the blade was sharpened, Marie Antoinette's body had already been turned into a battlefield. In revolutionary France, execution did not begin with death. It began with images, pamphlets, songs, cartoons sold on street corners and passed hand to hand. The revolution understood something ancient and dangerous. If you can control how a body is seen, you can control how its destruction is justified. Marie Antoinette's physical presence became the center of this campaign, not her policies, not her decisions, her body. Artists depicted her as grotesque and predatory. Exaggerated features, open mouths, distorted poses meant to suggest sexual excess and moral corruption. These images were not subtle. They were meant to provoke disgust, not debate. The message was clear. This was not a woman worthy of sympathy. This was a creature that needed to be removed. For years, she had been accused of sexual depravity without evidence. Lovers invented. Affairs imagined. Each rumor fed the next. During the revolution, these insinuations hardened into accepted truth. The body of the queen was no longer private, nor even human. It was a public object, endlessly interpreted and judged. And this mattered deeply. Political executions risk producing martyrs, but moral monsters do not inspire loyalty. By saturating the public with obscene caricatures, the revolution ensured that her death would feel necessary rather than tragic. Violence, when preceded by dehumanization, feels clean. The accusations of incest played a central role in this transformation. They fused sexuality, motherhood, and betrayal into a single, unbearable image. Even those who doubted the charge absorbed its emotional effect. The idea lingered, and once planted, it did its work quietly, eroding any remaining instinct for mercy. You might wonder why such extremity was required. She was already condemned. The verdict had been reached. Why continue the assault? Because revolutions are fragile things. They fear reversal. They fear doubt. And doubt often begins with empathy. If the crowd had seen Marie Antoinette as a suffering woman, questions might have followed. If she had been allowed dignity, comparison with the violence of the new regime would have become unavoidable. So dignity had to be stripped away entirely. Her aging body, weakened by confinement, was mocked. Her white hair was turned into proof of decay. Her silence was framed as arrogance. Even her restraint was interpreted as guilt. Every possible reading was engineered to confirm the same conclusion. The female body, especially when associated with power, has long been treated as something that must be controlled, corrected, or punished. Marie Antoinette became the perfect vessel for this tradition. She embodied foreignness, femininity, authority, all of it concentrated into one figure who could not fight back. In the days leading up to her execution, crowds gathered not out of curiosity, but expectation. They had already consumed her destruction through images and stories. What remained was the physical confirmation of a process they believed had already ended. By the time she was led from her cell, many no longer saw a person walking toward death. They saw a symbol being removed, a stain being cleaned, a body finally catching up to the narrative built around it. And that is perhaps the most horrifying truth. The guillotine did not silence Marie Antoinette. Propaganda did. Her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the story the revolution needed to tell. Which leads to the final question of this descent. If her identity, her motherhood, and even her body had been taken from her, what, if anything, remained when she finally faced the blade? By the time Marie Antoinette was sentenced, the execution had already taken place, just not in the way history usually records it. The blade had not yet fallen, but the woman who would meet it had been systematically emptied of everything that once defined her. What remained was not defiance, nor hope, but a quiet awareness that there was nothing left to lose. In the final days, her world contracted to a few square meters of stone. Light entered the cell briefly, filtered through iron bars, then disappeared. Sleep came in fragments. Guards never left. Even grief was supervised. When she learned that her son had been forced to testify against her, there was no private moment to collapse, no space to mourn. The system did not fear her tears. It feared what those tears might awaken in others. Psychological execution works through repetition. The same walls, the same faces, the same silence. Day after day, Marie Antoinette was reminded that resistance was pointless. Appeals were ignored. Rumors of mercy were allowed to circulate, then quietly withdrawn. Hope itself became another instrument of punishment. And yet, something unexpected occurred. As her social identity was erased, a different presence emerged. Witnesses described her final days not as frantic or hysterical, but restrained, focused. She followed routines carefully. She spoke politely to guards who despised her. She wrote letters knowing they would never be delivered. These were not acts of submission. They were acts of control, the last form of agency available to someone whose body had already been claimed by the state. On the morning of October 16, 1793, she was told it was time. There was no dramatic announcement, no final speech prepared, just instructions. She was given a plain white dress. Her hands were bound. Her hair, already cut short days earlier, was adjusted once more. Every gesture was efficient, impersonal. The revolution had perfected this ritual. As she was led through the streets of Paris in an open cart, the city watched. Some shouted insults. Others stared in silence. This was not the triumphant spectacle promised by propaganda. What they saw was a thin woman, visibly ill, standing upright not because she was fearless, but because there was nothing left to protect. She did not look for sympathy. she did not look for forgiveness. Contemporary accounts note her composure, not because she was unfeeling, but because grief had already done its work in private, under watchful eyes. At the scaffold, she stumbled once, stepping on the executioner's foot. She apologized. That single word, spoken in the final seconds of her life, reveals the deepest cruelty of what had been done to her. Even after being dehumanized, accused, stripped, and displayed, she still reached for civility, for social order, for the habits of a world that no longer existed. The blade fell, the crowd reacted, and history moved on. But if you look closely, the true horror is not in the moment of death. It is in the weeks that came before. In the deliberate dismantling of a person so complete that by the time she was killed, the act itself felt almost redundant. Marie Antoinette did not simply die at the guillotine. She was prepared for death, which forces a final reckoning. If a society can decide that humiliation is necessary before justice, what does that say about the justice it claims to serve? You are often taught to see the French Revolution as a clean break between tyranny and freedom, a necessary violence, a painful but righteous birth of modern democracy. But when you examine what was done to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine, that narrative begins to fracture. Popular memory tells you she was executed because she was guilty. History tells a more complicated story. What actually occurred was not simply punishment for crimes, but a carefully staged public ritual designed to reassure a frightened society. The revolution did not merely remove an enemy, it transformed her into a spectacle so complete that questioning her death felt immoral. Compare this to how power usually falls. Kings are overthrown, regimes collapse. But here, destruction was not enough. Her suffering had to be visible, extended, repeated. The public needed to witness her humiliation as proof that the old order was truly dead. The longer the degradation lasted, the more justified the violence appeared. This pattern is not unique to France. Across history, women associated with fallen power structures are often punished differently from men. Their bodies become sites of symbolic control. Accusations shift from political failures to moral corruption. Sexuality becomes evidence. Motherhood becomes suspicion. Where men are accused of tyranny, women are accused of monstrosity. Marie Antoinette's trial follows this exact logic. Her husband was executed as a traitor to the state. She was executed as a corrupting force, a contaminant. The distinction matters. It reveals how deeply gender shaped the revolution's sense of justice. The consequences extended far beyond her death. The normalization of public humiliation as a tool of moral cleansing reshaped revolutionary culture. Once cruelty is framed as virtue, escalation becomes inevitable. The same tribunals that condemned Marie Antoinette would soon turn on former revolutionaries themselves. Suspicion devoured loyalty. The spectacle demanded new victims, and the public adapted. Crowds learned to consume suffering as civic duty, to watch not because they were cruel, but because they believed cruelty served a higher purpose. This is how terror sustains itself, not through constant violence alone, but through moral justification. What is perhaps most unsettling is how familiar this structure remains. Today, reputations are destroyed publicly long before any verdict is reached. Bodies are scrutinized. Private lives are weaponized. Guilt is assumed through repetition rather than evidence. The tools have changed, but the logic has not. Marie Antoinette's humiliation teaches a chilling lesson. When justice becomes performance, truth becomes irrelevant. And when truth is irrelevant, anyone can be selected next. The guillotine ended her life, but it did not end the system that required her suffering. That system survived. It adapted. It learned how to operate without blades, which leaves you with an uncomfortable question. If humiliation still precedes destruction today, how far removed are we from the scaffold we believe we left behind? What happened to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine is not only a story about the past, it is a warning about how easily moral certainty can turn into cruelty when a society convinces itself that suffering is necessary. Revolutions promise justice, equality, and liberation. But they also inherit fear. Fear of enemies, fear of reversal, fear that without constant proof of righteousness, the new order will collapse. In that fear, restraint becomes weakness, mercy becomes betrayal, and humiliation becomes a tool of governance. Marie Antoinette's ordeal reveals how systems justify excess by redefining humanity. Once she was reduced to a symbol of corruption, her pain ceased to matter. Once her body was framed as dangerous, control over it felt virtuous. The revolution did not ask whether its methods reflected its ideals. It asked only whether those methods produced obedience. This is the lesson history rarely teaches directly. Oppression does not always arrive wearing the face of tyranny. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in language about justice, about cleansing, about necessity. When humiliation is framed as moral instruction, the line between accountability and abuse disappears. You might believe this belongs safely in the 18th century, but look closer. Modern societies still destroy people before deciding their guilt. Reputations are dismantled publicly. Personal lives are exposed and interpreted as evidence. Silence is treated as admission. Emotion is treated as manipulation. Once a narrative hardens, facts struggle to survive. The technology is different. The mechanisms are faster. But the psychological structure is the same. Marie Antoinette's story forces an uncomfortable realization. The danger is not only in violent regimes, it is in collective certainty, in the belief that this time humiliation is justified, that this person deserves it, that moral ends excuse cruel means. There is also a gendered lesson that cannot be ignored. Women in power, or even women adjacent to power, have historically been punished not just for what they do, but for what they represent. Their bodies become symbols. Their morality becomes public property. Their suffering is aestheticized, moralized, and consumed. The future depends on whether societies learn to recognize this pattern early, whether justice can resist the temptation of spectacle, whether accountability can exist without dehumanization. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes when its warnings are ignored. And Marie Antoinette's final months remind us of something deeply unsettling. A society does not become cruel all at once. It becomes cruel by convincing itself that cruelty is deserved. The question is not whether we are capable of doing this again. The question is whether we will recognize it when we do. Marie Antoinette's death is often remembered as the final act of a fallen monarchy. But what history tends to overlook is the long, deliberate process that came before it, the isolation, the humiliation, the transformation of a human being into a symbol that could be safely destroyed. She was not only executed by a blade, she was executed by narrative, by repetition, by a system that needed her suffering to feel justified. These stories matter because they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous violence is often the kind that convinces itself it is righteous. When humiliation becomes acceptable, justice quietly loses its meaning. If this story unsettled you, it was meant to. Share this video with someone who believes history is simple. Leave a comment with your thoughts or similar stories from your own culture. And subscribe to Forbidden Chronicles to continue exploring the dark, forgotten corners of history that still shape who we are today. Because remembering is not about the past. It is about recognizing the warning before it becomes familiar again.